Hi, Shenaaz. My name is Risha.
I'm Andrea.
And I'm Cindy, and we are part of the Monsoon VPP Youth Intern Team. Shenaaz, thank you for joining us today. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks you all for having me. I'm Shenaaz Janmohamed. I use she and they pronouns. And I'm the founding director of Queer Crescent, which is an organization centered on healing justice with LGBTQIA plus Muslim folks, or queer and trans Muslims. And I'm also a healer, a therapist, a cultural worker, and a parent of a child and a little fur baby who's next to me today. And I go hard for Mira and hard for Monsoon, so y'all are really lucky to be working with such a bright star. She's special for sure.
So we know that you work with mental health. Could you tell us why is mental health important in the API community?
Yeah, I mean, I think mental health, access to mental health support and resources is like a basic right. It should be available, accessible, available financially to everyone. So API folks in particular, to your question, but I think in general, mental health services, everyone needs, not just in the pandemic, but always. And, you know, to me, like the short answer is, I think that mental health is so important, and having space to be with and be witnessed and be held in the experiences of trauma, and also as a way of mitigating internalized oppression or unhooking from internalized oppression, recognizing what has been given to us in the name of colonization, in the name of capitalism, etc., and how to kind of separate who you are authentically versus the narratives that have been given to us. And I think mental health is just one avenue to do that work and heal from that.
So Shenaaz, based on what we understand, we know that you work with mental health and a lot of social issues like sexual assault, domestic violence, and patriarchy. So I'm wondering what kind of services that you do that work to combat these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a big part of my work is doing cultural work, and to me, in the past, I would do workshops within communities, for example, Muslim communities, around looking at patriarchy and understanding the wide scale prevalence of patriarchy. Like it touches all communities, but the ways that it touches and the ways that it lands and the ways that it folds into particular communities is unique. And so I would do work in the past more focused specifically on patriarchy and addressing kind of the harmful ways that we were replicating cycles of violence. And at some point I wanted to be more in a space of possibility. I wanted to be more in a space of less responsive and more proactive and kind of visioning forth the communities that we all deserve and have been waiting for, that feel supportive, that feel healing centered. And so I think of cultural work is doing healing work where spaces are thought of and designed knowing that survivors are part of our community, right? Like knowing that disabled folks are part of our community, knowing like how do we really think about who has been seen as disposable or discardable and recentering our communities, holding each other closer in mind. And so to me, that is a way of like being survivor centered, doing programs that meet survivors of DV, of different forms of violence at the center, but in a place of like radical possibility and love. And not kind of in like a service provision model, which can feel very power ridden. You know, it's like we show up in all parts of ourselves and relating to one another.
I had a question about how we can find these communities that we can help, and how have you throughout the pandemic been able to connect with these communities?
You know, in some ways, I think like the pandemic has made spaces more available to me. I'm someone who is finally learning the important lesson of the impact of being overstretched, the cost of being stretched thin. And so, community spaces, cultural spaces prior to the pandemic were really hard for me to make and dedicate time to show up in. As a parent of a young kid with several jobs, a lot of commitments, I couldn't show up in communities the way that I kind of politically would orient to or feel committed to. And so with the rise of everything going online, and I say that with the caveat that they are communities, in particular disabled communities, who have always met or need to meet online in virtual spaces prior to pandemic, that there's a lot of learning and wisdom from disabled folks to turn to. But in the pandemic, things were more available for me to participate in, organizing spaces, trainings, because everything was online, and it didn't matter where you were calling from or if your baby was in the back or your kid was watching the show or whatever. So I was able to access more places through this time because the limitations of like travel, space, time didn't feel as pressing. And I think that is one of the lessons of disability justice, is how do we make places, spaces more available and accessible, regardless of those things like time, space, access, like how do we connect inside of the material conditions which do not benefit too many of us.
That was awesome, and I loved hearing that. I wanted to backtrack a little bit. I wanted to ask, what made you start getting into activism? Why did you want to start organizing?
How did I get into organizing? Well, I think, I was born and raised in Sacramento, and what I often tell people is I survived Sacramento because it was actually outside of Sacramento, Fair Oaks, very like homogenous white, middle upper class wealth communities, and my typical experience was being the only brown kid, only brown girl, and I think from an early age, I'm grateful that my parents, in many ways around class, were very much assimilalist, but culturally had a lot of pride in being Muslim, in being Shia Muslim in particular, and so there was a lot of pride, and it was like clear expectation that whiteness was not something that we were trying to assimilate and ascribe towards. And so then when I experienced a lot of the racism, at the time I would call it bullying, but now I understand it as racism, I had that kind of backdrop of there's something, maybe not the language that I would use to it now, but there was something that my folks, my mom in particular, who seeded like white supremacy is the problem. But I think what I didn't have as a kid was support and mirrors, like people who looked like me or who had shared struggle. And that's what organizing has always been around for me, is communing with other folks within shared struggle, feeling a part finally of something together.
So then who would you say like inspires you to become an activist? Like, would you say it was your mom or?
She would love it if I said that. I mean, yeah, yes and no, for better or worse, right? She definitely helps me get to therapy on time, and we struggle together, right? There's intergenerational stuff for sure, that she also holds, and but I digress. It's cliche as a Muslim, but Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, going back to my youth, like I feel really grateful that was a text that landed in my hands, and I had the good enough sense and to read about Malcolm X, and there was just something that felt really powerful. He embodied such a liberatory Islam informed by Black liberation and power and the Black Power movement. His commitment to like an internationalist Islam, an internationalist politic, anti-imperialist, was really resonant for me. And so, yeah, it continues to be a North Star. And then, of course, there are so many queer and trans ancestors, that also have deeply inspired and shaped me. Audre Lorde, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, James Baldwin, so many. I feel really inspired, especially in the US context, by Black, queer, feminist ancestors and scholarship and organizing. And then, I think that everyone that I meet in movement inspires me in some way. Like all of us who are coming together, like who are seeing beyond the harm, there's always something that inspires me in these connections with folks. And so I take a lot of inspiration from everyday folks that I get to come across. And lastly, I'll say that I also draw inspiration or I feel a sense of connection to spirit ancestors through trees, through the ocean, the insistence on continuing to show up and hold presence that the trees and the ocean and so many other beings demonstrate is incredibly encouraging for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. You mentioned that you work with many different communities and on issues that combat on these issues that you highlighted. I'm wondering, what is the highlight of your career?
Ooh, wow. Well, I'm a young 40, so I hope the highlights are yet to come. I would say the relationships that I've been able to build. I'm not just saying this because it's Shenaaz, but Mira Yusuf is like one of those bright stars in my friendship constellation, my chosen family constellation. But these relationships and people's commitment to their truth and their power, the insistence on being, on healing, and the supports that I have felt to do my own healing.
I love that. So we like to wrap up these interviews asking the question of what advice would you give to someone who's an aspiring activist?
Well, first I just want to tell any young folks coming up, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And you get to begin wherever you are. It's right on time. And that there's this quote, and I want to say it's Toni Morrison, but now I feel like I don't know exactly. I have to look it up. But I think it's Toni Morrison who says, your feelings are, I'm paraphrasing, but your feelings are your deepest sense of knowledge. Again, paraphrasing. But there's something that feels so important in like learning to trust your intuition, learning to trust your feeling, your felt sense of power, of imbalance, of injustice, of love, of possibility, that felt sense, even if you don't have language or the frameworks, to trust and follow that. Because that's the seed, that's your core. And then I would also just say to young people what I also am saying to my younger self who needed to hear this back then, that there are people who will be excited to meet you and love you. And if you have not found those folks, keep looking until you arrive.
Thank you so much, Shenaaz. That was so insightful, and we really do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come speak with 3 teenagers about activism, because all of this is so important to us. So thank you again.